Hi, my name is Noah. I am a photographer. I'm learning photography. I'm based in the northeastern United States, and really I am just going on this journey of learning photography, learning how to express myself through creativity, while also learning how to be a good photographer. So today we are talking about the Sigma. I forgot the name. Sigma 17 to 40 millimeter 1.8 constant aperture internal zoom art lens for the Fuji system. I had the pleasure of renting this lens, not buying it, renting it for 4 days and using it on my first ever client shoot. It wasn't paid. I'm just trying to build a portfolio. But I had the pleasure of actually testing this out in what resembles professional work. But what is this review not? This review is not a technical review. Really, I haven't had enough time to live with this lens in the way that I have other lenses that I have. And so I'm really just trying to give you some impressions on this lens, review what this lens is used for, or what I felt it was really helpful for, where it really shined, and what is it not for. So, as I said, I rented this lens specifically for a shoot that I had this past weekend with a few friends of my wife and I. It was a couple shoot that we were going to take photos of in Boston, in Beacon Hill, and in the Commons, and in Back Bay. And so I was super excited. This, for lack of better terms, was my Grail lens. This was the lens that I had thought would solve all of my problems, that after shooting with it, I would simply float around and take pictures like an aerial drone. But that's not what happened. Well, it's not that it didn't live up to my expectation. I do think that my expectation was in the wrong place. So first, let's go through my experience. This lens, for what it is, worked entirely as marketed. It was a super fast lens that replaced a bunch of primes more or less for a shoot. However, what I will say is my expectation going into renting this lens is that it would replace the need for any lens at all that was in the 17 to 40 millimeter range. What I realized specifically in this type of setting is that 17 to 40 is not necessarily a great range for client-centered photography, more or less. This may shine if you are doing wedding photography or event photography to have a wider focal length. However, I didn't really touch this lens below 30 millimeters at all. And so it felt like I just used a 40 millimeter prime, which I do feel like that's the experience that I've heard other photographers have with zooms, that they more or less just kind of shoot it all the way open or all the way closed. That's not an issue. However, for the price tag that this lens carries, I do think that if you are expecting this lens to be a bunch of primes, it'll never lock you into the constraint that primes do. For example, I recently got this Viltrox 56 or just 56, 1.7, and it was the tightest lens I've had, and it fundamentally changed the way that I was shooting. But because I was locked into that constraint, I felt like I started to think in that focal length. Having the option to zoom between 17 and 40 gave me options, and I found myself overwhelmed with those options more often than not. What you might be concerned about with this lens is 3 things. Number 1, is it heavy? Is it big? This lens is definitely big. I have used the Fujifilm 16 to 55 2.8. That lens it felt way heavier than this lens. I do know that it is shorter than this lens, but it's definitely fatter than this lens as well. This lens was much lighter than I anticipated. And if we're being honest, I didn't notice that it was too heavy or too much of anything, really. it did a great job at being a solid lens. The image quality I felt that I was getting out of this camera, combined with the 40mm sensor out of the Fujifilm X-T5, were great and absolutely everything that I would have expected. I didn't feel like focus was missing or like the autofocus was slow at all. The autofocus worked somewhat flawlessly. I didn't necessarily have any issues locking on, even in low light. Now, I had planned the shoot kind of dusk into the evening, and so half of the shoot was filmed with overcast light, and the other half was shot at night, under nightfall. And so using this lens in conjunction with random street lights in the city worked really well. And where other lenses may have a hard time locking on, especially if you have an aperture that's more than 2.8, this did not have that struggle at all. And so I really did appreciate that. You've seen some of the pictures. I've told you a little bit of my experience. Who is this for, and why am I not buying it? Why am I not buying my Grail lens? What I've noticed through this experience specifically is that primes provide a constraint that I'm not ready to give up yet. I do think that this is a great lens, and I think that it would be great for anyone who is doing more variable shooting. If you like shooting landscapes and then want to shift into shooting portraits, it's got you covered. However, where it loses out on that is portability, size. This is not a lens that I would recommend to travel with, as I can imagine after a full day of carrying this around, it might be a little bit cumbersome to have on all the time. Something smaller, like a prime, like the Viltrox, or even a pancake, like the 27mm f2.8 pancake would work much better for that, while still locking you into a constraint. However, if you are only shooting two things, landscape and portraits, it may be worth just having two different primes. Two different primes would likely be the same size as carrying something this big. And so I'm not necessarily concerned that I'm losing out on anything with not going for a zoom. If you are doing professional work and this focal length speaks to you, I would definitely say go for it. However, I do think that I could have done the entire shoot on the Viltrox 56mm 1.7 and been entirely fine. In some cases, I do think that the tighter focal length could have actually served me better than the 40mm equivalent. So, to wrap up, this lens is great. It's wonderful, but it's almost like meeting a celebrity. You realize that they're not all that they seemed to be. And so, if you are struggling to decide between this or the 16-55 or any other amount of zooms, what I would ask you is, how important is aperture for you? For example, if it's really important that you shoot in low light and that's really where you want to excel and you want the bokeh that a fast aperture lens provides, this is definitely the option. However, if you want more range, like a 16-55 or Sigma's 18-50, I would definitely say go for that if aperture is not as important to you as range is. But really, it's in your prioritization of those two things that I feel like this finds a place in the market. I think that they've done a really good job offering a fast aperture zoom, and it's really impressive. However, as far as usability for the focal range, I do find it limiting at times to feel like I'm capturing what I want to capture. That I couldn't do on a prime, on a fast prime. So, something to consider. I do think that this lens is not for everyone. If you're comparing it to other zooms, I would absolutely say it really is, do you want range or do you want speed? Do you want a wider focal range or do you want a faster aperture that's better at night and in portrait photography? However, like I said, I do feel that in a portrait setting, this focal range actually isn't the most optimal. I think if it sat 17 to 70, like I believe Tamron makes a 17 to 70, but it's f2.8. If it sat at that range and was super fast, or even if it sat at 23 or 35 to 70, I think this would solve all of my problems. I would just float on it around. I would not have to pay taxes anymore if they made that lens. I would not pay taxes on the lens. I would evade the IRS if they made that lens. I'm kidding. I'm a law-abiding citizen. Anyways, that is my quick impression, debrief, review of this lens. It is going right back to lens rental tomorrow, and I am sad to see it go, but I'm happy for the lesson that it taught me, which is zoom versus prime. Variability is not always the right answer. Not only is it not always the right answer, sometimes constraint is the exact thing that we need to communicate creatively. If you like this quick review, please leave a comment. Let me know what you think, what you are trying to prioritize, and maybe I can answer some questions on if it's the right lens for you. If you're interested in a little bit more of the conversation that I talked about as far as finding my creative journey, I'm hoping that this channel will do and explore a little bit more of that. So stay tuned if that sounds interesting to you. Thank you. Peace.